This is CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Today, the legal consequences and questions around public safety surrounding the fatal shooting of Corey Ruiz, and a state appeals court overturned the latest ruling on Act 10. Plus, our special Neighbors Only segment today is dealing with internet trolls and bots during a moment of crisis. Hello, it stinks. That is what we're dealing with. We're going to get into it. But before we do, I want to call out a bit of breaking news. Thursday afternoon, Mandela Barnes announced he was suspending his campaign for governor. He made the announcement on social media saying, quote, "It's become very clear who our nominee is going to be, and I've said it from the very beginning, the number one goal was taking on and defeating Tom Tiffany." In his address, he doesn't mention her by name, but the presumed nominee he's likely referring to is State Representative Francesca Hong, who recent polls have shown her taking a wider lead in the field. But it's still anyone's game. There are lots of undecided voters. We will continue to bring you the latest on the governor's race and the primary, but now we're going to turn our attention back home to Madison. We've been covering the fatal shooting of Corey Ruiz, a Madisonian who was shot and killed by a Madison police officer during arrest. And now we want to specifically dig into the legal questions and possible consequences of what transpired. Joining me now is Associate Professor of Law at UW-Madison, Ian Main. Ian, welcome to CityCast Madison.
Thank you, Bianca. It's really good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. And for the full roundup, our own executive producer, Haley Sperling. Hey, Haley.
Hey, Bianca. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Ian, you recently wrote an opinion piece for the Wisconsin State Journal about the shooting. And what's clear is the situation has stirred up a lot of heartbreak, anger, and fear in Madison in so many directions, as well as a lot of legal questions. The public wants to know what happens next. And I just want to level set for everyone, including you out there listening, that this moment and the story, the situation is so loud. There's a lot of noise, and we're making a space to talk to an expert, help be the light and integrity right now. And we're keeping it real. It's really hard to know what's happening in all of this noise. Ian, you've been trying to be a voice in this morass. Like, is this just us? Like, it's very hard to keep track of what's happening with all of this noise.
It is. I've been part of the conversation for some years now when it comes to other police shootings in Wisconsin that have national repercussions, or say, criminal trials like the Rittenhouse trial that have national repercussions. And they're very controversial. They bring up a lot of emotions. I've been speaking in this matter as well. There is a difference, and it's a noticeable difference. I've received the kind of vitriol that's been expressed regarding the opinions, or when I come on to even give an interview that's just about the investigation and the next steps of the investigation. This sort of response is, in many respects, really, really angry. It's not looking to engage with conversation at all. And a lot of it is really dehumanizing of Mr. Ruiz and violent in nature. And so that's been a real surprise to me and a shift. There's always noise, but it's been amplified to a degree now that's been really concerning. And it goes at the issue, I think, of attempting to discredit what I have to say. And that goes to a broader point. Part of the thing that I've been saying is that the community has a voice here about how they want to be policed, and that the police themselves are not the experts in how we have encounters between humans and citizens and civilians in Madison. That this is something where many of us have expertise about how is the best way to go forward, to communicate with each other and to mediate issues that we think affect our community. And policing is at the center of this, and we have a voice. And so I imagine there's other people out there who are attempting to be part of the conversation. And I know you are being subject to a lot of bots or people who are out there and being really angry. And I want to say to you that it is tough. I want to validate that it is tough. But I want you to also encourage you to keep speaking.
Yeah. And this moment is about public safety. And I don't know if Madison feels more safe right now. I don't feel more safe. The next Madison Common Council meeting for August 4th was moved virtually amid public safety concerns after multiple city government workers have received threats. Ian, I do want to dig into the piece that you wrote. You did an opinion piece for the Wisconsin State Journal about the shooting. And what's clear in the situation is all of this heartbreak comes along with legal questions. And in your piece, you say, quote, police will likely find that taking his life was consistent with officer training and justified. We've all seen the video, and despite the many calls for the arrest of the police officer, even from some local officials, how is it the case that this would be consistent with training and justified, this outcome?
Yeah, in many, many respects, it's not surprising to me. I review many, many shootings in different jurisdictions for the training protocols themselves to lead to this result. In other words, we can look at, as Madisonians, when we look at this shooting of Corey Ruiz and be rightfully horrified. When I teach classes about police training and students really dig into what that training is, they start understanding that the roads, because of training, start leading to this result. And understanding that the way that police are trained to react and to understand a situation in many ways are predetermined. And this is something that Chief Patterson actually said in the press conference, that once certain things happen, for example, here, the presentation of a knife, the options for the officer become extremely narrow. Now, that is not something that we should accept as that's how we should be policed. What it is to say is that it reflects the training that officer received, if that makes sense. When I say, which is, if there is a deadly weapon presented, then we have some principles that are going to come into play that are going to affect the perception of the officer in assessing how to act next. The first one is always maintain a tactical advantage. And so that could be understood in many different ways by, say, someone who's not part of training. But if you're part of police training, that means always be in a physical position in which you can act in a way that is tactically privileged versus the civilian. I like to say, they'll say suspect, and that's another word that we can discuss, the dehumanization that goes on, but a civilian. The other one is really dangerous, and it's this idea that the reactionary gap that's taught to officers. In other words, that if they're reacting to somebody who's moving toward them, they're always going to be slower and at a disadvantage. And they explain this in lots of different ways. In this incident, for example, Mr. Ruiz has a knife presented. Mr. Ruiz could do a number of things with that knife, right? And it could be that he's just holding it up. It also could be that he moves forward toward an officer. The training from an officer's point of view, and I want to be very clear, I'm just talking about training. I'm not talking about how I think something should be handled. But in terms of the training and the officer's perception at this point, think about that principle that reaction is slower than action and that you should always, first principle, maintain an advantage. The idea that Mr. Ruiz could move forward now puts you at a disadvantage. And so that's going to push you toward using deadly force in order to ensure that you are not going to be in a situation that you don't have the tactical advantage and that you are going to be reacting too slow. Those two principles very much drive policing. If you look at the state standards, for example, for the defensive and arrest tactics, it's called the DAAT. It is what, say, Madison police officers are taught under. It's about 200 pages, okay? The word threat comes up over 200 times. How many times is the word de-escalation or de-escalate come up in that 200-page document? Are you ready? Once.
Wow.
And it's in a definitions section. In other words, it's actually never actually used during the discussion of the protocols. So we could more accurately say zero.
Wow.
And so if we think about training, if we think about the officers who are put in stressful situations, they are trained to think that they have to maintain a very kind of force first kind of posture vis-a-vis the, as they say, suspect.
I'm curious to dig into that a little bit more. Like, what role can and should de-escalation play in these situations when, a potentially deadly weapon is presented? Like, it feels almost as if these officers are being put into that fight or flight situation. Do they need more training to be, I guess, held to that different standard in order to reframe that mindset, in order to make these quick decisions? Like, how do we bring de-escalation further into that conversation so that it is coming up more than once in these training manuals?
Haley, it's a great question. And I first just want to focus on when you say the idea of fight or flight, right? Let's talk about that just for a moment, because in this situation, the police are immediately very close to Mr. Ruiz. Now, many people might rightfully and understandably say, why didn't they back up? Why didn't they give him space? And I want you to then go back to that first principle, which is always maintain a tactical advantage. Police are taught that if they take a step back, they have created vulnerability. They allow more space and time for the suspect to act, plan, and move forward, strategically hurt them while they're backing up, which is a tactically disadvantage, puts them at a tactical disadvantage. Even what you said, which is super reasonable, would violate training, right?
Yeah. Is there any language around neutralize the threat in their training? I feel like I've heard that term before in self-defense. Where's the legal differentiator or what they should be doing if you're going to use a gun, shooting them in the head versus shooting them, not to be too graphic, but somewhere else that could neutralize or keep them in a space of advantage if they were truly afraid for their lives?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the sentiment of that question, Bianca. And if we can take it in two stages, the first one just to directly go at what you're talking about, when is deadly force justified? And then if we can just put a pin in the other one, which is why were police in this situation in the first place? Because by the time they've decided to tackle, as far as I can see, Mr. Ruiz, and then having 3 people on him immediately, you've already gotten way past the possibility of the traditional de-escalation tactics, which are, by the way, taught to the Madison Police Department, but they're way past de-escalation once they're on top of Corey. That's one aspect that when we start talking about de-escalation, I think we should have a moment to step back and talk about how that might have gone here. But if we're going to talk about when you can use deadly force from a legal point of view, again, I'm going to stick to legal right now, and then we can talk about how problematic that is if we want to back away from it. But you might have heard before that you're allowed to use deadly force if you as a person have it's reasonable for you to think that you're subject to imminent risk of great bodily harm or death. Now that's a standard, that's a community standard in many ways, but not for police. And that's especially true for the determination of whether, for example, there's criminal liability here. Because under the Wisconsin statutes, while all civilians and police are subject to the standard that I just mentioned, if any of us are going to defend ourselves with deadly force, we have to reasonably believe that we're subject to an imminent risk of great bodily harm and death. But police are allowed to say we were also in the course of doing a public duty. And if you're in that moment, you're a police officer and it's pursuant to a public duty as a police officer, now other aspects are going to come into play. Those include training. And so if you're going to have a criminal trial against an officer here, it's not just going to be, did you have a reasonable belief that you're an imminent threat, a great bodily harm or death? It's also going to be, what was your training and did you follow training? And that's going to be part of the criminal trial. And if the training says, yeah, you didn't have any options, then that goes to, as I said in the op-ed, we should expect justified use of force here, because it's additional build-in of the expectation to use force in these situations. You also mentioned, could the officer have shot in different areas of the body and things like that. And I will be, first from a legal point of view, and this is just straight up legal. Once you are privileged to use deadly force, it doesn't matter how that deadly force is used. You can imagine, for example, a jurisdiction that says, we ban chokeholds, we ban the use of chokeholds. But if an officer in that jurisdiction is subject to an actual or reasonable threat of imminent great bodily harm or death, that officer can use a chokehold to defend themselves legally, right? And so I absolutely, I think, agree with what you're suggesting of just like how horrifying it is here that this individual, Mr. Ruiz, was shot in the face. It's horrifying from so many different levels. In terms of legal justification, if there is a justification to use deadly force here, the officer is privileged to use that deadly force however it's used.
This is just such a hard conversation, and we appreciate you coming on to share those legality around the situation, because people are calling for justice. We have a Common Council president, Sabrina Madison, who has openly said we need to bring charges against this officer. The officer is not arrested. Before we let you go, the people's voices are loud right now. Folks are calling for change. What role do you think the Civilian Oversight Board and citizens have in creating police departments that create public safety for all and lower the risk of anyone dying when being apprehended?
Yeah, Mr. Ruiz should not have been subject to a police encounter given what was going on and was reported publicly. He was not committing a crime. It's a possibility that he was in the course of attempting to commit a crime, but certainly what we've heard is that checking door handles is not a crime. And so this part's on us. This part is on who we are as Madison. It's on who we are as a society. How are we going to view when we see someone who is checking door handles? How are we going to understand that? Are we going to understand that as this is a person who needs to be subject to punishment? Or are we going to put that within a society that is really, really unequal and racist and ask ourselves, is this a person in need? And if so, what kind of expertise and support do we have in Madison itself that we could then approach Mr. Ruiz and see what those needs are and help make him part of a stronger and healthier community. From my perspective, that should have been our approach. Instead, it was an extraordinarily violent reaction to someone in my opinion, who is in need, to tackle him and under what I would suggest is extraordinarily questionable legal circumstances if a crime has not been committed, which I didn't see a basis for one. There was no reason to send squads speeding through streets over someone getting away on their bike on something that really should be a public health issue. When you're starting to send in SUVs through neighborhoods, that's putting everyone at risk and creating harm to everyone. When you're at the end of this incident, not only have you killed somebody, but you've also shot this person in the middle of a busy intersection, putting bystanders in substantial risk of serious harm. There's a whole host of reasons why this should never have been a police matter. I do want to mention before I go, is another question I think we should all ask, because I think we've normalized the radical, is, ask ourselves, what percentage difference do you think we should have in terms of people being stopped or the issuance of citations or the issuance of arrests? What kind of percentage disparity should we have between racial groups? In other words, how many, what percentage should it be more likely that a member of if a Black person than a white person should be cited or stopped? Now, I asked my classes this, and, there's a lot of people, of course, who would say zero, and I respect there should be zero tolerance for any kind of difference between treatment between racial groups. I absolutely agree. What's our tolerance? Is it 5%? Is it 10% difference? Is it 20%? I have not gotten a student in any of my classes to go beyond 15%, that there should be a difference in the likelihood of being stopped or given a citation. In Madison, traffic stops for the Black population is 500% higher. Not 0, not 5, 500%. And we have normalized that. If there are people out there saying we don't have a problem with our training, I don't know how you can say that with these statistics. And when it comes to the issuance of citations, it's almost 600%. And when it comes to arrests, it's almost 850% higher. And so, yeah, we see the deadly force and the horrifying consequences of what occurred to Mr. Ruiz. And that is like the most violent representation of the tip of an iceberg, in which we have incidents of force and incidences of harassment, which is a huge part of the experience of our Black and brown civilians here and Madisonians. I want to put this kind of use of force within that perspective, that this takes place within a carceral system that has a lot of parallels to apartheid.
I'm really glad that you brought up those statistics and like those numbers there too, Ion, because we talk about trolls and we talk about people in the comments section, and people love to point out the records and Corey Ruiz's criminal records and whatnot. But then it's like you also look at the records of police arrests and stoppages and citations, and saying 500% difference between Black people getting stopped on the street versus white people getting stopped on the street. I mean, it's almost inconceivable. And I think that like if folks want to say, look at the data, look at the numbers, we have to be looking at those police record numbers more so than we need to be looking at these individuals who are now just becoming victims of this system. So I really appreciate you bringing that context there.
I'm glad that you're not mincing words there. 500%. That should be shocking to the system. And it's been normalized, like you said earlier, that we have normalized a radical society. And the people that are trying to uphold the status quo, what are they protecting? Because it's an unconscionable state. It's an unconscionable state. And you said that the people have the power. Do you believe that comes through something like a civilian oversight board? How can folks get involved? Because I think people do want to take action and don't necessarily know how.
It's a great question. I think talking about it, what we're doing here is important, getting out information and making people more aware of what the problem is really, really important, and giving the space for people to talk. That's also up to our leaders to invite more people in with expertise to talk about, which includes people who are subject to this constantly every day, and to make sure that their experiences are represented in any kind of record, that legislative record, or whenever we're assessing what training should be in our community, and to not let the police officers control the conversation and to claim expertise. I think that it's really tough for leaders to do this because they're going to be subject to a lot of vitriol from a lot of powerful places. So I don't want to say this with any naivety that when our legislatures do that, it's not risk-free. And it's going to take a lot of courage for them to invite other voices that are generally not heard to be heard in this space and to be validated.
Well, Ian Main, I know that you're going through it. Thank you for coming on the show and lending your expertise. And I appreciate that we're able to be so human in this moment, and you're putting humanity forward. So thank you for that and your work. And for folks to know, you're Associate Professor of Law at UW-Madison. Thank you for coming on CityCast Madison.
And thanks again for having me and for everything you do. Very much appreciated.
All right, we're continuing on for this roundup. We'll be back in a second. So, believe it or not, Act 10 is back in the news, and it's significant. This week, a state appeals court overturned a 2024 ruling from a Dane County Circuit Court judge who declared parts of Act 10 unconstitutional. This move is setting up what will likely be a very high-stakes case for our state Supreme Court. There is other news happening, believe it or not. It's hard to believe that. But Haley, you've got the story here. But before we get into the details, can you briefly remind folks what Act 10 is?
Yes, Act 10 is huge. And for folks who weren't in Wisconsin when it was passed, like myself, here's a quick refresher. Put very, very simply, Act 10 is a law that Republican Governor Scott Walker signed in 2011. It fundamentally ended collective bargaining rights for most public sector employees. It essentially stripped all of these general public employees, like teachers and state workers, of their collective bargaining rights so they could no longer negotiate their working conditions, benefits, wages, like all that good stuff that comes with literal employment, right? According to WPR, before Act 10, it was much, much easier for public workers to organize unions, collect dues, negotiate wages and benefits and stuff. Part of Act 10 also banned unions from being able to deduct their dues from employees' paychecks. So this really undercut their funding and ability to organize. So one key thing here, which is where we're getting into the news of today, quote unquote public safety workers, so that includes local police officers and firefighters, they were completely exempt from these Act 10 restrictions, which made their unions much more powerful. And as folks may or may not recall, even though I wasn't here, I definitely remember shortly after Act 10 was unveiled, massive protests came out in Madison. People demonstrated at the Capitol for weeks. There were attempts to get Act 10 off the table. State Senate Democrats forced a delay on the vote by literally leaving the state. They fled Wisconsin to say, we're not going to vote on this. But at the end of the day, it didn't matter. Republicans were able to pass Act 10 without Democrat support about a month later, and Walker signed the legislation in March of 2011, and it took full effect in June 2011. And here we are today with Act 10 essentially as strong as ever.
Yeah, it's been a saga. It goes back and forth, but it's at the roots of the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin's history with unions and it runs very deep. We don't have time to get into it, but the birthplace of a lot of unionization and union work. And yeah, this has been going back and forth in the courts. It was obviously a huge deal for public opinion and just changing decades of the way people worked and moved through the state. And yeah, that was 2 years. We've made it 2 years and it's back. Let's get up to speed with that on the news. What's in this recent ruling, Haley, and how did we get to this point where there's an overturn?
Yeah, so starting with how we got here, back in 2024, a Dane County Circuit Court judge struck down major parts of Act 10, calling it a violation of the Wisconsin Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. But that Dane County court judge stayed his order, which essentially has kept Act 10 in place ever since. And at the time, union lawyers tried to get the case in front of the state Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court at the time said no and kicked it down to the District 2 Court of Appeals, which brings us to where we are today. So earlier this week, as you mentioned, a ruling from the conservative District 2 Court based in Waukesha reversed this 2024 decision. The thing that's really critical to note about this decision, though, it essentially sets up our Supreme Court to take up this case. And as we well know, following the past few years of elections, and there's going to be more in the future, just wait, Wisconsin's Supreme Court has a majority of liberal-leaning justices now. When Justice-elect Chris Taylor is sworn in at the start of August, the court will have a 5-2 liberal majority. And I should note, for good measure, that the court is technically a nonpartisan body. But if we're being frank, and as we have been in the past, it's nonpartisan in name only. We do know where a lot of these justices stand on this issue, in the fact that some of them have said, they have advocated against Act 10 and they're not going to recuse themselves from these hearings if and when they do come down the line.
The tug of war continues. I'm actually going to turn us to fun and turn to our weekly neighborhood shout outs. This is where our members, aka CityCast Madison neighbors, get to share their love for people and places in our community. I've got the shout out today. Kim I wrote in and she said, quote, cheers to the staff at Thai Basil on University. I accidentally left box leftovers on the table. I was half a block down University when I heard someone running yelling, ma'am, you forgot your leftovers. Thanks for having my back, Thai Basil. Kim, I love Thai Basil, and I know there's a special place in heaven or Nirvana or wherever for folks who make sure you get your leftovers. I have been that server, and it's an extra effort.
It's literally the most devastating realization when you get home from a night out and realize that you left your leftovers at the restaurant. This happened to me recently. I was like, oh my God, I was going to eat these mini corn dogs for a midnight snack, and now I can't. Shout out to the folks at Thai Basil. Like, wow, what a stand-up establishment. I'm obsessed with that.
Yeah. You've got good employees. You got good employees. I know we're talking about employees and unions.
It all comes together.
It all comes together. And hey, we love our neighbors. So we want to shout out all of our CityCast Madison neighbors. And a quick note of housekeeping. We have officially rescheduled our neighbors meetup, which is exciting. It's happening next week now. So neighbors, check your inboxes because you should have received an email with more information. We'll also remind you of the details in Monday's Neighbors Only events newsletter. Come together, come hang out with us. We need to be in community. And if you're out there and want to join us for that Neighbors Only meetup, you can become a neighbor. Head to membership.citycast.fm/Madison. And coming up next is our Neighbors Only segment. We've been looking for your comments and questions about this really hard time, about how the community is feeling following this fatal shooting. And trolls have entered the chat. And also for local public officials. We're going to talk about it. So if you want to hear that segment and get the other perks of being a CityCast Madison neighbor, again, head to membership.citycast.fm/Madison. Haley Sperling, thank you so much. I just want to give you a note on this podcast for everyone to hear. You've been doing tremendous work as the executive producer on this podcast, and I know it's been quite a lot emotionally, and you are keeping your cool. You are a tremendous person, and thank you for joining, as always, for this Friday News Roundup.
I appreciate you so much. Thanks, Bianca.
That's all for today. Here on CityCast Madison, I'm your host, Bianca Martin. We're produced by Jedi Siri Ramos. Katie McMurrin is our post-production producer, with help this week from Francisco Kilgore and Laura Kondarajan. Haley Sperling is our executive producer. Our theme music is by Carl Christensen. Additional music this week by Wendy Marchini and Sarah the Instrumentalist from Epidemic Sounds via Getty Images. Rob Thomas is our newsletter editor. You can get more news delivered right to your inbox by subscribing to the CityCast Madison newsletter. And if you enjoyed today's show, why not share this episode with someone who cares about public safety for all? All right, see you back here Monday morning, y'all, with more news and stories from around the city. Until then, thank you for listening. Take excellent care and have a great weekend.